A Western government, citing faulty intelligence, intervenes in the Middle East, setting the stage for a great regional struggle. But it's not Iraq, and it's not 2002. It's Egypt in 1956. The Suez Canal crisis of 1956 was born of geopolitical and personal conflicts that challenged British imperialism, highlighted Cold War tensions, and proved that a post-colonial nation could stand up to its former ruler. The Suez Canal, in Egypt's future, had long been tied to European interests in commerce as well as imperial ambition. In 1856, a French civil engineer, Ferdinand de Lesseps, embarked on surveys that proved that a Suez Canal was feasible and opened a company to start construction in 1858. However, as construction costs piled up and share values declined, the British aristocracy, led by Lionel de Rothschild, bought up about 40% of the company's shares. And as French power declined in the 20th century, British interest in the Middle East grew. The fall of the Ottoman Empire and Europe's increasing reliance on Middle Eastern oil led the British to establish a 90,000-man garrison to protect British interests in the canal. What would become a Cold War conflict almost a century later started as a compromise in the 1800s. Great Britain, through their financial investments in the canal and their military presence in Egypt, created a compromise whereby the canal zone was controlled by the British garrison, and the Egyptian king deferred to the British in the region. However, by 1950, the political climate in Egypt was changing. Rising Lieutenant Gamal Abdel Nasser led a coup against the British puppet, King Farouk, and succeeded in securing promises from the United States and Great Britain not to interfere. Nasser successfully extracted these guarantees by promising that he wouldn't lean towards communism. He successfully negotiated with the British and the Americans to ease his rise to power. Little did the British know, however, but their Suez Canal compromise was about to fall apart. As Nasser ascended to the presidency of Egypt in 1954, many nations were choosing sides in the Cold War, between the communists, led by the Soviet Union, and the Western powers, led by the United States and Great Britain. Nasser, by contrast, used his diplomatic prowess to keep both Khrushchev of the Soviet Union and Eisenhower of the United States competing for Egypt's support. He successfully maintained a policy of neutrality through a series of compromises with both rulers. And by 1954, he had arranged American financing for the Aswan Dam project and even secured departure of the British garrison at the Suez Canal. It seemed as if Nasser could achieve all his goals without confrontation with any global powers. By 1956, however, Nasser's agenda increasingly challenged that of new British Prime Minister Anthony Eden. Eden believed that Nasser was a communist puppet based on faulty intelligence fabricated by MI6. In fact, Nasser had jailed many of Egypt's communists, and his dealings with Khrushchev only reinforced Eden's suspicions. An arms deal with Czechoslovakia and support for communists overseas brought the countries closer to a major confrontation. Then in July 1956, Eden convinced President Eisenhower to pull out of the Aswan Dam deal in response to Nasser's diplomatic posturing. Nasser was furious. The Aswan Dam was not merely a source of power, but also a symbol of prestige for Egypt. Withdrawing funds humiliated the newly independent Egypt, which had long relied on Western credit. After the Aswan Dam deal fell through, Nasser began to reevaluate the decades-old compromise his predecessors had negotiated with Great Britain and France over the Suez Canal. Determined to prove that Egypt could stand up to the West, Nasser hatched a plot that would ultimately bring Europe to the brink of nuclear war. Nasser conspired with his closest advisors and concluded that seizing the Suez Canal would be an appropriate retaliatory measure against Eden. His chief advisor, Mahmoud Yunus, collected 30 trusted men to plan the seizure of the canal. Due to the secrecy of the operation, no one in Egypt, not even Nasser's cabinet, would know about the seizure until it was complete. On July 26, 1956, Nasser delivered a speech in Alexandria detailing the proud history of Egypt and its exploitation by imperial enemies. Within the speech, Nasser included a password that would signal Yunus's 30 men to seize the canal's 4 main offices. The password was Lesseps, the name of the canal company's founder. Nasser spoke for 2 hours that night. Not taking any chances, Nasser said the password a total of 14 times. By the morning, Nasser's agents had seized all 4 operating rooms of the canal and declared it nationalized. Foreigners were given time to leave their posts, and Nasser vowed that stockholders would be compensated for their share values. The news came as a shock to the world. While the British were stunned by Egypt's act of defiance, the UN Security Council recognized Egypt's claim, so long as all nations could use the canal, and Nasser at that point estimated the chance of armed conflict at 10%. But Nasser made a critical error that would ultimately spark the Suez Crisis. He blocked all Israeli shipping through the canal and through the Gulf of Aqaba, Israel's only other access to the Red Sea. Egypt did this because they wanted to assert themselves as hegemon of the Middle East and able to challenge Israel militarily. Eden, furious with Egyptian nationalization of the canal, decided to take advantage of Israeli belligerency. On October 24, 1956, the British Foreign Secretary, the French Defense Minister, and the Israeli Prime Minister met at a French village and drafted a secret plan that came to be known as the Protocol of Sèvres. Citing the Egyptian blockade, Israel would declare war and take over the Sinai Peninsula on October 29th. Then on November 5th, British and French paratroopers would drop near the canal to separate the combatants and to protect commerce. In truth, the Israeli invasion would serve as a smokescreen for the Anglo-French seizure of the canal. On October 29th, Israel invaded as planned and crushed the Egyptian army in a matter of days. On November 5th, the British and French landed and established a foothold at Port Said, where the canal joins the Mediterranean Sea. From there, however, the situation quickly deteriorated. Though pressured by his cabinet to surrender to the British forces, Nasser would not back down. Instead, he armed every single man in Port Said. The resistance at the port city was brutal. After a few days, Anglo-French troops had barely moved 10 miles. The Anglo-French armies thought that Nasser's forces would quickly collapse based on MI6's faulty intelligence. To the contrary, Nasser was gaining more support as the war dragged on. In addition, graphic images of the war were being aired on televisions across the world, creating sympathy for the Egyptian cause.
In fact, in the position today of having appealed to force in the case of a small nation, where if it is appealed to against us, it will result in the destruction of Great Britain.
Eden had made a huge miscalculation. At home, his rivals delivered searing anti-war speeches, and protests were frequent. In Egypt, the people were uniting behind Nasser against the British invasion.
Nasser sunk tugboats full of concrete in the Suez Canal and blocked all of the traffic out of the canal. And 66% of the oil of Europe went through the canal.
The oil shortage caused the value of the pound sterling to collapse and created economic panic back home in Great Britain. Then, on November 18th, Khrushchev, premier of the Soviet Union, threatened to launch nuclear weapons at London and Paris if a peace deal wasn't immediately negotiated. Eden, amidst financial and political turmoil at home and nuclear Armageddon from abroad, appealed to the United States for help. However, President Eisenhower, who was not told about the Sèvres Protocol, was livid with the British. He said he would only provide assistance if they withdrew from Egypt immediately.
The strategic idea was that if we distance ourselves from Israel and distance ourselves from the British and the French, that the Arabs would come toward us. But the exact opposite happened. After he did that, the United States got no clear benefit in terms of Arab alignment or Arab public opinion.
Facing crises from within and without, Eden capitulated and began the withdrawal of British troops, to be replaced with United Nations peacekeepers. By the end of December, not a single British troop remained in Port Said. As the peacekeepers arrived and negotiations began, Nasser knew that he would be able to keep the canal in any deal. Because Nasser managed to play Eden and Eisenhower against each other and create sympathy for his cause overseas, Nasser gained the advantage in reworking the Suez Compromise. Nasser sought to change his relationship with the West through calculated, strategic conflict. He did not seek to gain land or money on the battlefield, but rather used the battlefield to put Egypt in control of the Suez Canal and to amend the previous compromise. What makes the Suez Canal crisis truly unique is that Nasser used conflict against great powers and compromise at the United Nations to forge a way forward for his country. In the Suez Canal crisis, Nasser outfoxed Great Britain and the United States using their own creation, the United Nations, to amend the old compromise the British had forced upon Egypt regarding the Suez Canal over a century earlier. Control of the vital Suez Canal gave Egypt a chance at Arab hegemony during the latter half of the 20th century.